and welcome back to the latest episode of In With the Old. We're the video podcast focused on dispelling myths, building appreciation for God's Word, and helping you rediscover the Old Testament for the life of faith. Here we are in Season 5. We're going through the book of Habakkuk. I've got to say, it's been a fun journey so far. We've been hearing lots of good feedback, too, about it. I think this book really strikes a nerve for us, right? How do we wrestle with difficult questions? How do we deal with the fact that sometimes our theoretical theology doesn't line up with our perceived reality? I've been enjoying it. I know Dr. Tim's been enjoying it. I hope listeners, you have been enjoying it as well. Today, we're still in chapter 1. We've talked about Habakkuk complaining to God once. Last week, we saw God reply and throw some of the prophet's words back at him. And today, we're into Habakkuk's second complaint. I'm joined for today's episode, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Tim. Tim, what's going on? How are you doing today?
Ryan, I'm doing really well, and I just want to underscore what you said. I feel like people are responding to this well, and especially just the permission that God gives us in this book, both to ask the real questions that we have, and the reminder that sometimes it's God's servants. It's the people who spend their lives serving him, speaking for him, that have the most questions of all. And that's part of it. The more we know God, the more questions we're going to have. And so I love our discussions, and I'm looking forward to today, Brian.
Oh, yeah, me as well. So listeners, we're going to start this episode, as always, by reading from the text. So we're still in chapter 1, going into the first verse of chapter 2. As always, chapter breaks are not inspired. They were added late, and sometimes they miss the point a little bit. They miss it a little bit here. So we're going to be reading Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 11 through chapter 2, verse 1, which belongs with the section. We'll be reading from the Christian Standard Bible, so feel free to read along with us or pause this episode and go ahead and read it on your own side as well. And sorry, I said verse 11, it's verse 12. So starting in verse 12, "Are you not from eternity, Lord my God? My Holy One, you will not die. Lord, you appointed them to execute judgment. My rock, you have destined them to punish us. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you cannot tolerate wrongdoing. So why do you tolerate those who are treacherous? Why are you silent while the one who is wicked swallows up one who is more righteous than himself? You have made mankind like the fish of the sea, like marine creatures that have no ruler. The Chaldeans pull them all up with a hook and catch them in their dragnet and gather them in their fishing net. That is why they are glad and rejoice. That is why they sacrifice to their dragnet and burn incense to their fishing net. For by these things their portion is rich and their food plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continuously slaughter the nations without mercy? I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. I will watch to see what God will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint." So here we have Habakkuk talking. Last episode, Tim, we talked about the fact that speaker breaks are not noted. You don't have right and God said and Habakkuk said. But the verbs have switched back to the way they were at the beginning of chapter 1. So this is Habakkuk talking. And in reply to God's reply, right, the initial challenge was evil is being unchecked by God. God says, well, be careful what you wish for, right? In the end, everyone gets what they want, but we don't always like it. I am going to punish sin. It's the Chaldeans, and they're on their way. In this passage, we see Habakkuk go, hold up, that's not quite what I wanted. And listeners, for this passage, we want to kind of give you the big idea. And the idea is when we're faced with the tension between what God is, we think he's going to be, what we expect God to be, and who he actually is, we must work out our faith with fear and trembling by going to God in prayer. Habakkuk's fundamental issue in this passage is that the person he thinks God is supposed to be on paper and how he's seen reality live out don't line up. And he's trying to square that and trying to figure out who is God in the midst of this difficult time. Tim, help us as we get started here in verse 12, not verse 11. Apologize for that. Help us start seeing what jumps out to you about this second reply from Habakkuk that you go, oh, that's a really crucial point.
Yeah. So 2 or 3 things just to get started. as we think about this, it's important to remember we have a dialogue going on, right? So that's obvious. You have Habakkuk, you have God responding, but then you have Habakkuk responding again. And that's a reminder to me, Brian, just from the human side of this, how our questions really are something that are in process. Most of the time, as we consider, then reconsider, think about what God says, think about what the Bible says, it's not like we instantly get to the finish line. It's a process that God invites us into and graciously allows us to participate in. But then also, I just want to point out again the bleeding edge of this. We read it in black and white. You can read the whole book of Habakkuk in 10 minutes. But this is the heart cry of someone who is devastated because he truly has nowhere else to turn but God, but he doesn't understand. And that's what we see in verse 12, where he says, "Are you not from eternity, Lord my God? My Holy One, you will not die." So in a sense, to use our theological language, he's using the character of God or the traits of God, the attributes of God, saying, God, okay, I know you're from eternity. You are eternal. I know you are holy. You won't die. And Lord, you appointed them to execute judgment. So God, you are in control. You are my rock. You are eternal. I recognize that I am but dust. But God, what on earth is going on here? So we see both sides of this tension. We see in a rhetorical question what Habakkuk is saying, but we see even just the angst in his heart of, God, how could you allow this to happen? You have all power. You know more than I do. But God, everything I see on the ground says that this is wrong and it doesn't make sense. Again, this is just a powerful moment. And it's also a moment where Habakkuk walks out in faith, sticking his neck out, saying, God, I recognize who you are, but I just don't understand. So those are some things that I see in verse 12, then in verse 13. The rhetorical question is obvious, but Brian, let me kick it back over to you. What do you see here in these couple of verses that really help us to understand what Habakkuk is arguing and saying?
Well, I think I like how you said this is the bleeding edge. We see in this passage that we're really uncovering Habakkuk's root issue. So it's funny, right? In the first complaint, Habakkuk goes to God and says, well, there's injustice you aren't dealing with. And then I think even last week, Tim, you said, right, God's reply isn't actually an answer to Habakkuk, right? It's a challenge back to him.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see the logic of that. God's wisdom and how he replied to Habakkuk is because it's uncovered the deeper fundamental issue. Because Habakkuk's going to put in stark terms, I have a contradiction, God, in who I believe you to be and what I'm seeing happening. So how do I resolve that? Right? We've now finally gotten in some ways to the root of his problem. I see in verses 12 and 13 and the following verses, some time has passed. So here's something else I don't think is marked in the book of Habakkuk. We don't have the speaker changes marked. We don't have the passage of time. We often think of a dialogue as a podcast like we're recording right here, right? Where we're talking back and forth. This all happens in one sitting. I don't think that's what's happening in the book. In the beginning part, right, when God mentions the Chaldeans, and we don't see any awareness that Habakkuk is concerned about them, right? His concern is for the moral degradation of his people. In this reply to God, what do we see? Especially the latter half, maybe verses 14 and following, there seems to be a very conscious, a very tangible fear of the Chaldeans, of imminent invasion. That tells me as a reader that time has passed. And I want us to wrestle with that. This is a back and forth with God that doesn't happen overnight, but was given time. These are questions that had to be wrestled with, pondered with. There were many sleepless nights, I'm going to surmise, in the prophets kind of debating, dialecting with God. And that's significant. That's helpful for us because I think we live in an age of convenience, Tim, right? We want quick, easy answers. There is no quick, easy answer to evil and God and sovereignty and these various issues. Instead, it does require some fear and trembling and working things out. Going to the text itself, right? So that's kind of some big ideas and starting us in. I do see that Habakkuk starts with a lot of theological points, right? And he asks a rhetorical question, are you not from everlasting? The answer, of course, is yes. Habakkuk is trying to set up, God, here's who I know you are. You're eternal. You don't die.
Mhm.
You're sovereign, right? You've appointed the Chaldeans as judges. Okay, you've done this. You are a good God. You are too pure to look at wickedness. But that is my fundamental problem. You don't look at wickedness with favor, but you are looking at favor with them.
Mhm.
You're raising them up. They are going to punish us who are more righteous than they, right? They're wicked people. This seems to be a violation of your character. So
Mhm.
what gives? And Tim, isn't that a very relatable moment? Haven't we all asked questions like that? Maybe with different answers, maybe more flowery or fruity language, shall we say, in
Mhm.
the moment. But God, how could this be? Is this not a contradiction of who I believed you to be?
Mhm.
And I see Habakkuk kind of setting it up. I don't get how you can be okay with this, God, because the Chaldeans are going to be wicked people,
Mhm.
right? It's a very practical, it's a very down to earth and relatable concern. At least I think it is. Um, in verses 14 through 17, he's going to go and describe the Chaldeans. And we can go image by image if you want, but the big idea is, look, they we're like the fish of the sea people, right? They're the fishermen. They're the ones dragging everyone up by hooks, by their nets. And God, here's my problem. They don't look at you as the person who's established them as judges. I recognize, Habakkuk says, right, that you're sovereign, you've made your choice, but they don't recognize you. They burn incense to their nets. They worship their tools. They think, just as God said in verse 11, right, their strength is their God. They worship themselves. So why? Is that okay that you're going to use them to punish us? I think that's his problem. And Tim, I think it's actually an interesting question for us. How do
Mhm.
we deal or how do we wrestle with the idea of God using people to a church or a Christian perspective, people that are unrighteous? How do we deal with the fact that God can and does sometimes use them to advance his purposes? It's maybe a bit of a low question, but as a pastor, I'd love to kind of hear, as people come with these concerns, what are some of your thoughts, or how do you begin giving some guidance or wisdom to us in this area?
Yeah, these are heart-wrenching questions, especially, and Brian, this came to mind as we've been talking. No, I was talking with someone in my church the other day who they were telling me about their journal and the prayers that they were writing and the timing of those, and then come to find out later on that as they were praying for specific things, it came out that very specific dark things were happening exactly in those areas that they were praying for. And so nothing had changed in the
Hmm.
circumstance. And it was essentially the same question: Lord, how could you have allowed this to happen, even in the exact moment where I've been trying to intercede for you to intervene? And so these, again, are real questions. They're very sharp, they're very weighty because they deal with, honestly, the things that we care about most. And so dealing with this, okay, notice Habakkuk loads up this first complaint saying, "You're the Holy One of Israel," right? You are too pure to look on these things. So he uses that character trait of God to sharpen the point as much as possible. And then even in describing them, he says, God, this is how I read it, Brian. God, how is it good for them if they think that it's all about them when in fact it's you who are allowing them to do it? In other words, I think it pushes us back in some ways to even the complaint we read in chapter 1, when it's like, Lord, how is it that how can your law be effective if the unrighteous are rewarded? And
Right.
this gets to the heart of I think how it was so confusing for Habakkuk. It wasn't just like, God, this is really hard. Can you help me get through it? It's like, God, this violates everything about what I know of your plans and purposes. And all I know to say, Brian, is in our current church context, I think there's oftentimes such a limited permission to actually say what we think. We
Hmm.
look at what we see around us, we look at how horrible sometimes it is, and so I think we don't give ourselves permission to say, no, those people really are wicked. There's almost an over holiness where we all know we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and Christians are supposed to be the most humble people on earth. That's absolutely true. But it's also true that there are people who intentionally do harm to others. And that's what Habakkuk is saying. He's saying, God,
Yeah.
these Chaldeans are vicious. It's not just like they happen to sin, it's like they live to destroy. And so the first thing is we need to be honest about our enemies. We need to be honest that there are wicked people in the world who are intent on doing wickedness for wickedness' sake. But then as we work through that, we have to be ready to, as we've said, understand God does not owe us an answer to that question. And I say this to people often, whether they're facing grief or heartache or these questions about how God could use wicked people. We just have to recognize that we are not in a position to judge God's judgments. We're not in a position to evaluate them, even as we're given permission to ask the questions. And so, Brian, these are difficult things, and I think that's part of the point. It's meant to be difficult. How is it that these pagans, how is it that these people who don't know you and don't care about you could possibly receive your favor in any way? So that's at least a few things that come to mind. Brian, what do you see in looking at the text? What are some other just points that you might want to make?
Yeah, no, Tim, thank you for sharing that. That's really good. We're not in a position to judge God's judgment. That's fantastic. That's going to stick with me. Because that's kind of what we're jumping ahead, but in a couple weeks, listeners, as we get into the meat of chapter 2, that's going to be God's reply back, his kind of final reply as the answer to this book that Habakkuk's left to wrestle with is God is in his temple, let all the earth keep silent before him. That's Habakkuk 2:20. And that's going to be the final answer of like, look, God is sovereign and God is not like us, just better. He is categorically different. He is the creator, not the created. Yeah. And so because of that, there's always going to be these points where our conception of who God is cannot align with who he actually is, because we are not big enough, we're not grand enough, we are limited, and we are finite. And that's not always in the moment the most comforting thing in one respect, right? Because we like having answers. But in another respect, if, as Habakkuk rightly says, and God's going to push him on this, if you truly believe that I am the Holy One of Israel, then you will live because I have decreed it to be so. The righteous shall live by faith, which is coming up next week, Habakkuk 2:4. So it's on the one hand frustrating if we don't always get our answers, but on the other hand, it also has the potential to give us a great deal of comfort by understanding God's sovereignty. Now, looking back at the text, Tim, there's something really, I think, important happening here, as understanding the context behind this complaint has a lot of depth to it. And there's two different contexts we could consider, and it's hard to tell, and scholars have different opinions on which context this is. Do we put this, or do you read this story in light of the prophet's life, right, and the time he is in, or of when this book maybe was written, which is in the Second Temple a couple hundred years later? We can debate that all day, but either context adds a lot of depth to this complaint. Remember that Habakkuk is a contemporary of Jeremiah. So knowing that, this complaint, this worry about the Chaldeans comes during the kind of heady days of, can we say, nationalistic fervor in Judah, right? Jeremiah talks about, hey, everyone's really pumped that we have the temple. It's our talisman. It's proof that God loves us. It's proof we will never die. We're winners. Everyone else is losers. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but you get it, right? It's awesome to be a person of Judah. However, God is more than just a God of a single country, right? In this time, in the time of Habakkuk, the people had a very high view of themselves and a very low view of others. This attitude, I think, if we read it in this time period, right, helps feed into the incredulity that Habakkuk is feeling here. How dare you use these people to punish us? In this vein, we could see him in some ways similar to Jonah, right? This is a lesson Jonah is going to have to learn, and God's favor and God's control of the nations and God's favor and love for people that extend beyond sometimes our own limited appreciation or love of people, right? We really wish God would only love the people we love, and yet God continually keeps pushing, saying, no, I love everyone. I'm not going to be limited by just what you want. So that's one context this kind of complaint can be read against. Another context would be against the Second Temple period. And here, if it's written in that context, Tim, I think this adds some interesting depth, because in the Second Temple, Israel's trying to figure out what went wrong. How did we lose the temple, right? They're back in the land. They do rebuild the temple. It's called the Second Temple period. But even in the biblical text, God's glory never comes back to the temple. They're missing something. They're lacking something, and trying to figure out why. Where is God? Why is it? What did we do wrong? Well, and then this kind of then begins speaking into, look at what your forefathers missed, right? God is sovereign. Your forefathers screwed up by not recognizing that, by not being faithful to that, right? There's a lot of covenantal issues at play. And of course, God then brought in foreigners to punish you because you were covenant breakers. So either context potentially can be read in here. Don't necessarily want to go into like all the academic arguments one way or another. Just realize that Habakkuk's words of complaint have a lot of depth to them, whether it's in his own time, whether it's retrospective. There's a fundamental challenge of how can you use a foreign people to punish your own people that is going to be left unanswered, at least now, right? We have to wait for God's reply coming up. But Tim, we can't just end at the end of chapter 1. We have to include verse 1 of chapter 2 because it's a little addendum. This isn't Habakkuk's complaint to God anymore, but rather this is what Habakkuk says after he's complained. Again, going back, listeners, as I said, this is not a like back and forth conversation. There's time passing. And here we see explicitly it passes, right? Verse 1 of chapter 2 says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. I will watch to see what he will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. There's a lot of theology in there. Tim, why don't I kick it over to you first, because I don't want to monopolize the time here, but this verse always has jumped out to me as one of my favorite verses in the book. What do you see in chapter 2, verse 1?
Yeah, Brian, I cut out there for a second. So if I don't answer you directly, then I apologize. But as I look at this, and as I look at this ending, this is, again, Habakkuk assuming that posture of humility, which I want to argue is really only possible to assume if you have poured out the truth of your complaint. And so Habakkuk, okay, I'm standing guard. I'm going to, in other words, I'm going to do my job. Lord, I'm bringing my complaint to my supervisor. I'm still on the team. I still want to be faithful. I trust in you, even when I don't understand. But God, I don't understand. Why do the bad guys keep winning? Why do you use people who aren't just, kind of wicked, but are openly wicked? Why is it that the violence and injustice that you hate about your people is something that you seem to be, applauding with the Chaldeans? What is going on here? So it's kind of ends with a punch. I'm going to stop what I'm saying, but it's kind of like, I am expecting you to answer me, even as I recognize that I am your servant and I am not your master. So we begin this complaint with that emphatic rhetorical question. We end it with an emphatic statement. I don't understand, and here I am. Here I stand, I can do no other. And Habakkuk just gives it back to God. He really does. He pushes it back and says, God, what can I do before the eternal Holy One of Israel but voice my complaint and wait for you?
Yeah, really well said. I think it was J.M.M. Roberts in his commentary on Habakkuk, Tim, that pointed out something that's always stuck with me. Verse 1 of chapter 2 recognizes that Habakkuk can't compel God to answer him, right? Yeah. And that is, we've been dealing with this like frustrating yet comforting truths in this passage. And here's another one. A prophet can't make God answer on his own timetable. That's frustrating because in our lives, we want God to act in our time frame, right? We want him to reply instantly. But it's also comforting in the fact that, hey, if even a prophet can't make God reply, of course I can't make God reply to me. Instead, all we can do is do as Habakkuk did, right? Say, I'm going to stand my post. You alluded to Martin Luther. I also hear that here, right? Here I stand, I can do no other. Habakkuk's like, what else am I going to do? I'm going to sit, I'm going to wait. It's interesting. I can't make God reply, but I trust that he will reply. right? Habakkuk doesn't just throw up his hands and go, well, I just shot that into the breeze and I don't know if anything's going to happen. He says, no, I'm going to station myself on my watchtower because God will reply. And importantly, that very last line, right? What I should reply about my complaint or how I will be corrected. Habakkuk expects that his understanding is incorrect. I think that's interesting. He's expecting God to come back and not say, you're right, Habakkuk. Oh my goodness. Like, I shouldn't be using them. He's like, no, I know I'm going to be in the wrong here. That's a fascinating point for us, I think, then to consider. Where is that line between asking for answers and demanding responses and demanding God do what we want him to do? Habakkuk rides that line and I think shows us a powerful way forward. He doesn't hide from God. I think of David, right, as well. These are people who didn't really hide their emotional states from God. We get all of them. And in Habakkuk, we get confusion, we get anger, we get hurt. Yet he also recognizes he's not God. So he says, here's who I am. Here's where I'm at. I don't get this. So tell me how I'm wrong. I will listen, right? That's a fascinating line. And that's a helpful line, listeners, I think, for us as well. God doesn't want us to hide who we are from him because at some level, the only person we're hiding from is ourselves. You can't hide from God. Adam and Eve learned that in the garden. And I think we all need to learn that. We can't hide who we are from God. God knows us better than we know ourselves. Instead, what we continually see in Habakkuk's story especially is God asking for his people to be honest with them, but also be willing to recognize when they are wrong and be willing to take that correction. Habakkuk, we're going to see, is willing to take correction. He has been very bold, very in God's face, sharing his confusion, anger, and hurt, but he is also going to be, we'll see in chapter 3, willing to learn, willing to grow, willing to be corrected. And we see the first part of that here, which I think is very helpful for us.
Yeah.
So listeners, kind of putting a bow on chapter, or the second complaint rather, is this tension between who we expect God to be and who he actually is. And Habakkuk's wrestling with that, and I think offers us a good way forward as well. With fear and trembling, it's not an easy thing to quickly square or fix, but it's something that when we have these confusions, I think God expects and wants us to go to him and be willing to accept the correction when it comes. God is very fine with asking him hard questions, but we also then have to be ready for very hard answers when they come. So I think that's what's going on here. We'll see next week as we go into chapter 2, God's reply. We'll get the brief kind of prologue to that reply, and then the rest of chapter 2, which are the woes, as his full reply. So that's coming up both next week and the week after. Tim, before we let go of Habakkuk's second complaint, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of small things, Brian. As we think about Habakkuk, I think you can almost contrast the humility of Habakkuk with, say, the pride of someone like Jonah, who came to God in pride, saying essentially, God, you're wrong and you need to move in my direction. Habakkuk says, I don't understand, but I'm willing to move in your direction. And that's a very different mentality. And then the last thing I'll say, Brian, is the assumption of Habakkuk is that God, looking upon the Chaldeans, is in a sense rewarding their bad behavior. And that's where God is eventually going to come back and he's going to say, no, what I'm doing is not rewarding bad behavior. There's a difference between God blessing and God using. And God is going to end up using even wickedness for his purposes. But I think that's something that people really struggle with. You mentioned what's the burden as I talk to people pastorally. The burden is people see success as blessing. And what Habakkuk reminds us of, and what the Bible as a whole reminds us of, is that external success is not a mark of God's blessing. At times, in fact, external success can deceive us into thinking that God is blessing something that he's not. So we're going to talk about that more as we get into the rest of the book. But I just wanted to put that out there for those who may be listening and just wondering, why does God bless evil? God uses evil. He does, because he's sovereign. But God does not bless evil. He is the Holy One of Israel. And so Habakkuk knows there's more to the story. We're going to get there in the weeks ahead, and can't wait, Brian.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun journey. Listeners, we hope you join us for that. If you like this content, if you like what we've been doing, please share our videos out there. Give us feedback. I hate to do the silly YouTube thing, but like, comment, and subscribe. But let us know how we can best be producing these videos to help you out. That's why Dr. Tim and I do these, is we enjoy talking with one another, but we enjoy more producing content that can help people in their daily lives. So we hope it's been doing that for you. We hope you keep staying with us. And until next time, stay cool and stay home.